I've already talked about guilt by association, and that was a great factor. Next slide. Sometimes people today will say that nobody of any significance or influence or reputation holds to these views that I've been presenting here this morning. These are some of the people. F.F. Bruce was a Brethren scholar in England in his time. He's now deceased, but in his time he was probably the greatest New Testament scholar living. He wrote the foreword to The Fire That Consumes. He actually says in the foreword that as I define the terms, he is neither a conditionalist nor a traditionalist. But he said he takes the position of David will not the judge of all the earth do right. And he just leaves it open for God, but he doesn't believe in eternal torment. Michael Green was a great Anglican theologian who's still living. At one time he was the spiritual advisor to the Archbishop of Canterbury. He wrote a book called Evangelism in the Early Church that's a classic on that subject. He teaches conditional immortality. Philip E. Hughes was another Anglican scholar who taught for several years at Westminster Theological Seminary. Westminster is Presbyterian. They're in the very core of the people who defend traditional teaching. But Philip E. Hughes, who taught there in his book, one of his books teaches conditional immortality. W. Graham Scroggie was a British evangelical associated with the Holiness Movement and the Keswick Movement, and he taught conditional immortality. Dale Moody for 40 years was the chief Bible teacher at Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville. He's now dead, but when I was writing my book, he was still living. And I talked to him on the phone one day, and he said, I taught this for 40 years at Southern Baptist, and he believed that the conditional immortality was true. Clark Pinnock, who's written many books, is a Canadian Baptist, good friend of mine, and Clark has done a lot to put this teaching in the mainstream. John Wenham was a great Oxford scholar and Anglican priest and New Testament scholar. And he believed this so strongly that when he wrote his autobiography before he died, he titled his autobiography Facing Hell. And he said throughout his entire ministry he had been greatly troubled by what he considered the horrible teaching of hell. It was the popular view, and he considered his life worthwhile if he could do anything to help abolish that teaching. One little quick aside about John Wenham. He was in his 80s when he died a few years ago. About 1999 or something like that, 97 perhaps, I was contacted by Paternoster Press in Great Britain, who had been F.F. Bruce's publisher in England, and they said, we would like permission to produce a British edition of The Fire That Consumes. And they said the way this came about, they had gone to John Wenham and said, would you write a book setting out the biblical basis for conditional immortality? And Wenham said, the book is already written, it's The Fire That Consumes. And so they came and asked for permission to do that, which they did. And they met me at InterVarsity Press in Chicago and tried to get InterVarsity to co-publish it. InterVarsity said, we don't want to do that, but we would be interested in a Two Views book. So that's how the Two Views on Hell came about as a result of that conversation. Gordon Wenham, another scholar, is John Wenham's son. He teaches this view. Earl Ellis taught at Southern Baptist Seminary in Fort Worth until very recently. He holds this view. John Stott, who's been called the Dean of Evangelical Preachers and was one of the most highly revered evangelical scholars and preachers in the world today, has published this view. Since then, he got so much flack that he did not want to jeopardize a mission project he was involved in. And so he's kind of backed off a little bit and says now he's an agnostic on the subject. But he really, I think, secretly still believes it. Homer Haley, as I mentioned already, LaGard Smith, a Church of Christ man of great influence, is an Irishman by the name of Jim McGuigan. He holds this view and told me that he did from the time the book came out. Ed Wharton, a very conservative Church of Christ preacher and teacher, was in a meeting in Katy, Texas, where I lived several years ago. I gave him a copy of the book and said, I would appreciate it if you would read this and tell me what you think of it. He called me back on the phone a year later and said, I apologize for being so late getting back to you, but I didn't want to call you until I had something to criticize, and I can't find anything I disagree with. So he's on the same side there with this teaching. And the list could go on and on and on with many others. But if anybody ever says nobody except cults or weirdos or extremists or flakes or whatever believe this teaching, you can just say, well, I know that's not true. They're some of the most highly respected people. And then there's some disrespectable ruffians like myself who are part of the number as well. But these are some of the ones. Is there another slide, or is that the end of it? All right, that's the end of it. So in a nutshell, that's kind of where it came from and how I got here today. I hope in spite of having a good meal and I'm sure being sleepy and me not having a very good speaking voice, that you're able to stay awake and get something out of that. And I appreciate you being here. Thank you for your wonderful attention. You've been very kind to me. And I again thank Pastor Farmer for inviting me in the first place. If you want to take over and do any questions, it's 10 after.